All right, welcome in everybody. Thank you for spending some time with us this evening. My name is James Otteson. I'm the Executive Director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism. Thank you for joining us for a great event we're about to have. For those of you who weren't part of the conference, so I see some students here from Wake Forest who joined us for the talk. We had an all-day conference today with some undergraduate students studying What Adam Smith Knew, Some Moral Lessons on Capitalism. That conference was sponsored in part by the BB&T Center, also by the Institute for Humane Studies, funded in part by a very generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation. So we say thank you to all of them. The speaker tonight is someone who has written quite extensively on topics of interest to us. So something you may be interested to know, the BB&T Center in April, mark your calendars, April 14 to 16, is sponsoring an academic conference on corporate social responsibility. In fact, it's called Corporate Social Responsibility After 40 Years, What Good Has It Done? One of the speakers at that conference will be Bas van der Wassen. Professor van der Wassen comes to us from UNCG, University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where he's an assistant professor of philosophy. He did his undergraduate and master's degree studies at the University of Amsterdam, got his doctorate of philosophy at the University of Oxford, specializes in political philosophy, philosophy of law, also ethics and applied ethics, writes on quite a wide range of topics. One of my favorite papers of his that I read in draft form, but I haven't seen, I'm not sure if it's appeared yet, is called In Defense of the Ivory Tower, Why Philosophers Should Stay Out of Politics.
It's appeared.
Has it appeared?
Yeah.
Excellent. So look that up. It's a great paper, especially in an election year. So as someone trained as a philosopher, I pay attention to politics, so maybe I shouldn't be doing that. The paper that Professor van der Wassen is going to give at the Corporate Social Responsibility Conference is linked with the paper he's going to give tonight. Topic of his paper tonight is the tragedy of the stakes business ethics without zero-sum thinking. Please join me in welcoming Professor van der Wassen.
Yeah, let's hope that this talk gives me less trouble than the Ivory Tower paper, which I get into trouble for all the time. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks to you for coming out. Can you hear me all? Thank you. So, this is a talk about business ethics. Let me just give you a quick overview about what I'm going to do. And I'll get back to why this is a talk about business ethics. So I'm going to make 4 points. I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about what I think the role is of a theory of business ethics. So what should we expect of a theory of business? What makes it a good one? Then I'm going to try and use that idea about what the role of a good theory of business ethics is to come up with some sort of basic test for like a threshold. What's a test? What's a threshold that a good theory should clear for it to qualify as a good theory? I'm going to apply that to what is one of the main, maybe the dominant theory in business ethics right now, called stakeholder theory. Spoiler alert, I don't like it. And I'm going to give very roughly a sketch of the alternative, of what I think would be a better alternative. But I'm only going to lay out the roughest of outline. I have some more detailed ideas, but hopefully we can talk about that, or talk about other things. So I'm planning on 30, 40 minutes, something like that. Okay. Good. Click. So business ethics. I normally don't do a lot of business ethics. What I do is I write, well, apart from incendiary papers about philosophers staying out of politics, mostly I write about either international questions or questions about property rights. This paper came out of me thinking about the role of property rights in a just society. And then once we have a system of property set up, how should people within that system, if we think that property rights ought to be part of the economic system that we live under, how should people who work within that system, how should they behave? And that's, I think, the role of what business ethics is about. So I think it's a kind of political philosophy that we are doing. That's sort of more the broad umbrella under which I find myself is political philosophy. I think business ethics is a kind of political philosophy. Here's why. You can sort of narrow down the type of questions that political philosophers ask. There's a point to this, I promise. So at the most broad, most general level, right? So there's political philosophers ask themselves, is the state justified? Yes or no? If you've taken your intro to political theory or political philosophy, everything you know, there's stories about this. Hobbes has a story. It's rational to do this. Locke has a story. You give your consent. So that's the step. Right? These are questions about, is the state justified? Yes, why? Here's why. A little narrower. So, well, maybe if so, then political philosophers also ask, well, what's the appropriate role that the state should play in people's lives? A lot of people tend to think, the standard liberal answer, that there's a distinction between the public and the private sphere, and the state's business is primarily to deal with the public stuff and stay out of people's private affairs. Simplifying a little, but that's an answer, right? Narrowing a little further, okay, then if we've done that, so yes, there should be a state, we know sort of roughly what it should be dealing with, the public stuff, and I'm going to assume today that that includes some economic affairs. Then there's a question, okay, what are the types of rules and institutions that should be set up within that sphere? Right? So we're narrowing down, like, should there be a state at all? What is its role? And what should it do in exercising that role? And then last, right, when we really narrow it down, it says, well, if we set up those rules, which I'm assuming, again, involves some type of market society, how should people who find themselves in that, under those rules, under those institutions, should they behave? So that's a narrower question, but it's part of the same story, right? When we're funneling down, we're just concentrating more and more on just a subset of what the original question was. So here's what I think. Business ethics is a version of this last question, right? So how should we behave within something like a competitive market economy? So what does that mean? Well, it means that there are certain questions that we don't ask of a good theory of business ethics, right? We don't ask it to solve all of our problems. Right? We don't think that the theory of business ethics should be a theory of justice, period. It's only a part of the theory of justice. It's the part that deals with this sort of last narrower question. How should we behave within a certain type of institution, under certain types of rules? So what we want, right, from the theory is to focus only on that last question. What we also want, we would say, it's not just about the theory, right? It's about what the theory is telling us. The theory is telling us something about how businesses ought to behave under those constraints. And so when the theory is supposed to focus only on that limited set of questions, we're also saying that businesses have something of a limited set of responsibilities. Businesses are not supposed to be then necessarily occupied with doing everything that would be required to make the world just. But they have to do their job, whatever that might be. Right? Play their part. I think that's an important thing, right? And it should be fairly obvious, I think, but I think it actually has ramifications. The idea that we can't ask everything of everyone. There's a job that businesses are supposed to do in a good society. There's a job that you and I have to do in a good society. All right. So I want to depart when I go, take a step back, right? When we go start talking about what a good theory of business ethics would look like, let's start with an insight that comes from John Rawls. This is not a talk in Rawlsian theory. I'm not a Rawlsian theorist myself, but I agree with Rawls on a good number of things, one of which is the basic intuition that he has about what makes a society a just place. And he says, we're here, this is like the second page pretty much of the most important work he wrote, The Theory of Justice. Society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. Now, he writes it's not supposed to be necessarily a descriptive statement, right? Societies can be like that or cannot be like that. He's saying this is, if things go well, right, a just society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. His point is this, right? Look, if we live in a just society, what we're doing is we're operating together, right? We're working together, we're cooperating. We all have a job to do, and we do it in ways that work together to mutual advantage, so that we all are the better for it. And so there's an intuition here that he has that I think is really important, which is that if a society is going to be just, then it is going to be the kind of thing that is good for everybody in it. Terms of cooperation ought to be for mutual advantages. These are the type of phrases that you might invoke. So here's a couple other phrases that he uses. So he says, well, if that's true, right, if it's true that a just society is one in which everybody gains from the fact that we're working together, well, then it may be expedient, useful, right, but it's not just that some should have less in order that others may prosper. Right? So he says It's okay to make money in a just society. It's okay to prosper, but not in just any old way. Right? If the way that you make your money is by making sure that others have less, that's not justice. That's extraction. Right? Just society is supposed to be something more than that. It's supposed to be more than just filling your own pockets by taking it out of others. But, so here's the flip side, right? There's no injustice, says Rawls, at least from this point of view. Rawls added a whole bunch of things later that he thought would make it an injustice, but at least in principle, when at the beginning, it's not an injustice, he says. If the greater benefits earned by a few, or in the greater benefits earned by a few, provided that the situation of persons not so fortunate is thereby improved. So we might enter into an exchange. I might get rich out as a result. That's okay, as long as you're better off for it too. It's probably not enough just by itself, but that's at least the general vision that he's setting out, and that's an idea, that's an intuition about justice that he has. Now, if that's true, here then the last quote I'll throw at you. If that's true, then he says the division of advantages. He likes to talk about the division of advantages, the way that people's advantages are divided or distributed among society. He says, if we have this type of society where really people work together for mutual advantage in such a way that we all gain from working together, that we're all better off for working together, there will be a division of advantages. Some people will be well off, some people will be not so well off. But if we're all better off than we would be without each other, then he says it will be such that it will draw forth the willing cooperation of everyone taking part in it. That's a justifying feature, thinks Rawls. It's a justifying feature because it means that we can all sort of endorse, we can all be happy that we live in that type of society. Thankful, maybe. Thankful to live in a place where the fact that we have to live with others, or that we get to live with others, is something to be welcomed because it makes us better off. I think this is an important idea. And so the talk I'm going to give is I'm going to try and get to a theory of business ethics that makes good on this idea. And I don't think every theory does. In particular, stakeholder theory, as I'll get to later, does not make good on this idea. But that's why I'm bringing this up. All right. So Rawls likes to talk about dividing the division of advantages, right? How the advantages are distributed. That's not the only thing that we divide in a just society. One thing that we divide in a just society, at least if things go well, is the responsibilities amongst people. Today in the student conference, we talked a lot about the division of labor. So the division of labor is a division of responsibilities too. Right? When we divide labor in a society, plumbers don't need to be electricians. Right? The plumber has a job to do. The job of the plumber is to fix your plumbing. It's not to fix your wiring. Teachers, don't need to be Uber drivers, right? Software engineers don't need to be accountants. Accountants don't need to raise my kids, right? And so on and so forth. We divide the responsibilities by dividing the labor. Right? It's not the job of the plumber to fix my wiring. It's not the job of the teacher to drive you to the airport, and so on. Of course, we're talking about business ethics, right? Remember, the whole point of having a company in the first place presupposes that we divide the labor. If we all have to do everything all the time, there is no reason to cooperate because you're doing it all by yourself. Well, you have to do it all by yourself. So when we're talking about business ethics, we have to presuppose, in some sense, a division of responsibility through the division of labor. Right. It's better this way, right? This is a good idea. Better this way because when we start expecting our plumbers to fix our wiring, this is bad news for both our plumbing and our wiring, right? We know this. Maybe the first plumber will do a decent job on the plumbing and just mess up your wiring, but after a while, he won't have the time to keep up with the latest developments in plumbing, and he'll start messing up both your plumbing and your wiring. Right? If we expect too much of him, given he's responsible for both, he's going to do well neither. This is key, right? Remember what Rawls says. In a just society, we all gain from cooperating. That requires that to some extent we recognize that it's not everybody's job to do all the jobs all the time. Okay. Here's another way that we divide responsibility in a good society. We divide moral responsibility. We live in a world of divided labor. We also live in a world of divided moral responsibility, at least if things go well. So I claim. So business ethics, like I said earlier, does not have to solve all problems of justice. It's only a part of the story after all. What it needs to solve is whatever moral issues arise about how businesses conduct themselves within a broader just society, or how they conduct themselves within a broader market economy. Similarly, we are not responsible for all injustices. Right? Businesses are not just these things out there. They're made up of people. The plumber is a person. The teacher is a person. So if the business is not responsible for everything, then you and I are really not responsible for everything all the time. We are for our part, right? We better do our part well. We want the plumber to do a good job. That's why we make him or her responsible only for the plumbing. Right? And we try to reward him or her in proportion to doing a good or a bad job on the plumbing, not on everything. Might be a great teacher in his spare time. It's not what we're paying for. It's better this way, right? When we divide moral responsibility, it's better too. When we start expecting AT&T, I'm just picking on my own phone provider because I've got crappy reception at my home. So when we expect AT&T to solve world poverty, it's bad news for both our phones and for the poor. Might go from 1 bar to 0 bars. And world poverty is not likely going to be, that's not the answer, right? If you think about how should we solve world poverty, the answer is not, let's put AT&T in charge. It's not their responsibility. So, think about Rawls again, right? Rawls says we need to make sure that we all gain from working together and living together. Making sure that people are served by this, right? Served by living in a society, living together, means protecting them from becoming responsible for too much. We know that when we don't make AT&T responsible, it would be a bad thing, but we can do it. We can start expecting our plumbers to fix our wiring too. You can pass a law, see? Whenever you do home improvement, you fix all the problems. This is a bad idea, both economically, but also morally it's a bad idea, right? We have to protect people if people are going to do a good job in whatever their role is, whatever their part to play is in a society of divided labor and a society of divided responsibility. We have to protect them from becoming responsible for too much. And we have to make them responsible for their part. All right. So, if all that is true, right? You like what I'm saying so far, maybe you don't, but if all that sort of makes sense, here's a consistency test that we can develop, a test for evaluating whether a theory of business ethics lives up to being a good test for how businesses ought to act within a just society. It's not the job of a theory of business ethics to make the society as best it can be. It is the job of a theory of business ethics to make businesses fit within whatever that society might be. The theory of business ethics should tell us what the moves are that an individual player ought to be making in the game that we ought to be playing. So here's a test, a consistency test. A good theory of business ethics puts economic agents, whether they be companies, managers, individual salespeople, you and me as whatever, right? As producers, it puts them in a position to further their own ends through the ends of others. If you don't do that, if a theory puts us in a position to do something else, perhaps puts us in a position to prosper at the expense of others, to make sure that others have less so that you can gain. It fails the consistency test. Right? That's a theory of business. If a theory of business ethics would end up encouraging that type of extractive behavior, it would end up encouraging people to undercut the very foundations of a just society. It's very abstract. We'll get more concrete later, but that's the idea. We want a theory of business ethics to encourage companies, businesses, managers, producers to act in such a way that they make good on what I think is the Rawlsian intuition, which is they want to make good on living together for mutual advantage. Okay. All right, I'll take a step back. That was the abstract part. Let's get a little more concrete. Well, only a little more concrete. I am a philosopher after all. We talked in the conference today about the tragedy of the commons. So Garrett Hardin talks about this. The idea about the tragedy of the commons is why I'm bringing this up. Tragedy of the commons is a situation in which there really is too much responsibility and too little responsibility. That's the claim I'm going to make. But there's a problem. So here's the idea, right? What happens if we don't have the type of restrictions that are absent in the commons? Right? Well, what we lose is we lose the ability for people to focus on their jobs alone. Right? So here's an idea. Plumbers need to be able to afford focusing on their own jobs. They need to know that when they come into your house, they're not going to be held responsible for your wiring too. They need to know that if they come in and just fix your plumbing, they're not going to get sued for messing up their job because they didn't also fix the wiring. So they need to afford being able to focus on plumbing. That's the only way they're going to get good at plumbing. What that means is we, as consumers, right, consumers of plumbing, we need to constrain our actions. We need to recognize that there are limits to what we can expect of a plumber. Limits to what you can expect of an Uber driver. Limits for what you can expect of AT&T. Well, I'll tell you that good reception at my home is not among them. I can expect that. So we need to constrain our actions. You have to recognize that the plumber isn't responsible for your life, the company isn't responsible for your life, they're just responsible for doing a good job at whatever their responsibility is. All right. Here's the opposite, right? A little quicker than I would ordinarily go since we've talked about today already. But the absence of constraints, when we don't constrain our lives like this, when we do expect others to take care of whatever might be our responsibility, it's a zero-sum world. Right? So, quickly, we saw a video today about people in a developing country fishing in a lake, but we don't have to go to those type of things. We can think of the high seas, right? So using the paper, I use an example of fishing grouper on the high. So grouper, pretty delicious fish, right? But nobody owns the grouper, right? The grouper that are out in the ocean, because nobody owns the ocean. Problem is, when you start even if you said, well, I own this piece of ocean, then the grouper might swim in and then swim out of that piece of the ocean, and so you own the ocean, but you don't own the grouper. So what's the problem? We have, well, two people, right? Two people who each have fishing companies. They want to catch grouper to sell. Selling more grouper means more money. And to sell more grouper, you need to catch more grouper. So you have two options, right? You can fish a lot, or you can limit your catch. Now we know that if you keep fishing up the wazoo, right, at some point you're overfishing. If everybody overfishes, then you catch more fish than more grouper than groupers can reproduce, and so at some point the groupers go extinct. You have no grouper left. Stinks for both person A and person B, right? Because both of their fishing companies now go broke, bankrupt. No more grouper to sell. If person A owned all the grouper, wouldn't have to deal with person B, right? If person B owned all the grouper, wouldn't have to deal with person A. But if they don't, if there are no constraints on their behavior, we get this tragedy of the commons case, right? So this your standard prisoner's dilemma type case. The numbers here represent how good of a case it is. So 1 is the best, 4 is the worst. It's just an ordinal ranking. Person A gets to choose overfish or limit the catch, but doesn't get to choose for what person B does, and vice versa. Right? It's in the interest of both to catch more. Now, it's also in the interest for both to not both be catching more all the time, because that means you get all the groupers die. Right? So the best thing for both would be for both to limit their catch. That would be here. It would give them both their best option that they can have at the same time. Now, of course, it's even better if the other one limits their catch and you overfish, because now you fish more today and there's still groupers tomorrow. So each person is in a situation where they're not quite sure what the other one will do. So they go through the following reasoning, right? So person A thinks, okay, well, person B might overfish and limit their catch. Let's say that they really start fishing a lot, right? Should I limit my catch or should I overfish? Well, 3, that's better than 4, because 4 is my worst, so I should definitely overfish if they overfish. Now, maybe they limit the catch, right? Maybe they're really responsible or whatever. What should I do? Well, I can overfish, and then, well, that's my best case, because there will be grouper tomorrow, and I get a lot of grouper today. So it doesn't really matter what person B does, thinks person A. Whatever they do, I should overfish. Simple. So I'll overfish. Something happened? Oh, is that it? I'm not amongst these fancy... there you go. I'm not used to these fancy materials. Anyway. So that's what person A does. Person A thinks I ought to just overfish come what may. Person B is in exactly the same situation, right? Hey, A might overfish. In that case, I should overfish. Like, limit my catch would be the worst, so I should overfish. Hey, person A might limit the catch. Well, I should overfish because that's my best option. Now, you might think, well, they should just get together and have a conversation, right? But of course, in the real world, you're not just dealing with two people. You're dealing with 10, 15, 20, maybe 100 different fishing companies. It's very difficult to get everyone together. And even if you get them together, it's very difficult to know if you can trust everyone. You, as an individual company, probably won't make much of a dent into the group or population anyway. Might as well catch more. You never know what all these other ones together are going to do. Some might limit, some might overfish. If enough of them overfish, we're screwed anyway. I fish. But of course, everyone thinks the same way. And so you get lots of them overfishing, and the group are dying. And we know how to get out of this, right? We talked about this today at the conference. One way to do it is to have exclusionary property rights, where we just say person A gets to tell person B that they don't get to fish. Problem solved, right? Because now person A can fish as much up until the point where groupers keep reproducing, and so person A can now fish into perpetuity, at least if they're not completely irrational or crazy. If you can't do that, there might be other ways. You might try to have these sort of fishing quotas, like the European Union tries to impose this all the time, and then fishermen protest it because they think it's too low, and then environmentalists think it's too high, and so whatever. You have a limit, right, and you try to penalize people who exceed it. It's a little hard to enforce, but better than nothing. Either way, what we're doing is we're doing something that is similar, right? We're telling people what they're responsible for doing, how far they can go. We're imposing a constraint, either through property rights or through some sort of legal constraint directly. Right. Unpack it, right? What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the incentives that people are facing are destructive, right? That was the spiel I was just running through. Well, what are the incentives when you're dealing with this type of commons resource? Well, first, right, you want to use the resource because it's there. No one can stop you, so there's an incentive to get to it. So all these groupers swimming around, they're there to be caught. You're looking for a job, get a boat, right? Use the resource, that's one. Two, use it as much as you can, right? Get them before they're all gone. Third, if you can, reduce others, how much others are using it. Maybe if you're pulling out with your boat out of the harbor, you're out to get grouper, you see someone else with the same boat, you say, hey, where are you going? Any idea where the good groupers are? You might point them in the other direction. It's a zero-sum world after all. Everyone is fishing for the same groupers. If they catch grouper, the place that you're going, that's fewer grouper for you to catch, and vice versa. And reduce how many others sell it, how many others use it. If you can reduce the number of other fishermen, that's good news for you. It's more grouper for you. So, these are destructive incentives, right? The first two are going to be destructive for the resource. Since everyone has them, it means everyone is overusing them. The second two are destructive for our relations between each other. Right? This is not a recipe for fishermen to start liking each other or trusting each other. It's not a recipe in which fishermen can be happy that they live together, thankful that they live in a society where everyone has to fish for the same grouper. It's not mutual advantage at all. Right, so here's the problem. The problem is we haven't divided the responsibility accordingly, or as it should be. Everyone is responsible for maintaining the common resource, in this case the population of groupers, then no one really is responsible for maintaining it. Whose job is it to make sure that the grouper survive? Question, right? Like, whose job is it? Is it an individual fish? So you might say, well, each individual fisherman ought to restrict their fishing behavior. Was it their responsibility? Well, no, it's a shared responsibility between all the fishermen. Right? So everyone's responsible. Well, then who is responsible? No one is. It's not mine. It's not his. Right? It's not hers. That was an interlude. Promise you we'll get back to this. It'll make sense at some point. At least it does to me. So, stakeholder theory. Here's a theory of business ethics. Right? Back to business ethics. Probably the dominant one. I think that's not an exaggeration. Here are two quotes that sort of give you the sense if you don't know what I'm talking about. So, stakeholder theory. This is a quote from Mitchell et al. So, stakeholder theory. Basically, the idea is to broaden management's vision of its roles and responsibilities to include interest and claims of non-stockholding groups. So, yeah, it's an alternative, right? The idea was, in some ways, this was a response to a view that is famously associated with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said the responsibility of a business is to maximize stockholder value. Just make sure that the company is worth as much as it can be. No says stakeholder theory. It has to be broader than that. Now, how broad, right? I agree, by the way, it has to be broader than that. That part I like about stakeholder theory. Don't think that Milton Friedman was right. Well, how broad? Well, so what turns on who the stakeholders are, right? So, well, who's a stakeholder? Groups and individuals who benefit from or are harmed by and whose rights are violated or respected by corporate actions. That's Friedman. Arthur Friedman is the guy about stakeholder theory. So that's a little abstract. There's a translation. Right? So first step, the negative thing, why Friedman is wrong. Businesses should do more than just serve their stockholders' interest. So what should they do? Well, they should just basically serve the interest of everyone who's affected by their actions. That's generally how it's interpreted. So it involves the customers, it involves their employees, it involves the suppliers, but it also involves sort of the general community in which a business operates. An ethical business sort of takes into account, like all the people have interest in how it behaves, take all those interests, shove them on a pile, and then sort of try and make it as good as it can be. So that's roughly the idea. Freeman talks about the good manager as a King Solomon. That's a phrase he used, King Solomon, so sort of judging from a position of wisdom about how all the interests ought to be served by what the business does. So very quickly what the theory is about. I don't like this. Here's why I don't like it. It's what I call the tragedy of the stakes. Suppose you live in a society full of stakeholder businesses, right? Companies that take stakeholder theory to say, good news, right? Well, what would your incentives be? My claim is that your incentives are exactly the same as people have under a tragedy of the commons. Here are your incentives. First, make sure that you get a stake in what the firm does. Why? Well, if you have a stake in what the firm does, the firm has to start serving your interest. This is good news, right? This is a benefit. If you have a stake in how the company acts, your interest will have to be served by it if it's going to be an ethical business. Now, second, increase your stake. Make it as big as possible, right? Because the bigger your stake, the more it's going to serve you. 3, reduce the stakes of others. There's only so much a business can do. Less for them means more for you. Think about it as a fraction. You can increase the numerator, or you can decrease the denominator. And reduce the number of other stakeholders. This is the logic of a tragedy of the commons. You make sure you got a seat at the table, then you make sure that your plate is full. You make sure that there's nobody else sitting at the table, and if they have to sit at the table, you make sure that plate is empty. It doesn't strike me as a recipe for a peaceful, prosperous, ethical community. It strikes me as a recipe for disaster, really. Problem is the same. We make the business responsible for everyone around him. We don't divide up the responsibility like we would when we divide up the labor. Or when we divide up the moral labor between different branches of ethical thinking. And so as a result, now everyone and no one is responsible for their business. The manager is responsible for everybody. We're responsible, apparently, for how the business acts, because how we act, whatever stakes we might incur, affect how the business is going to be run. It's going to be a communal undertaking in the end of the day. Everyone is responsible. What we have seen already, if everyone's responsible, no one is responsible. Here's a question. What are the incentives for businesses? It's probably even more important. you start a business, and you can anticipate that if you're going to run that business ethically, you're going to create these incentives for people around you, you might think again about starting a business. So if it's not a recipe for a peaceful or a prosperous or a just community, it's also not a recipe for a community in which a lot of people are going to start new businesses. Doesn't strike me as a good idea. And you might think I'm being hysterical, right? Like, oh, just by having this theory in place, of course, it's not going to be like the overfishing on the sea, high seas. It's not going to be the end of the world. Not all businesses are going to run out of things. Here's how what the economist might say. All change happens at the margin. I'm talking about is to the extent that you start implementing these theories, to the extent that people who want to be ethical business owners, ethical managers, start acting on these ways, to that extent we're tending away from a society that lives up to what Rawls was saying, where we act for mutual advantage, and towards a society of zero-sum exchange, which is a tragedy of the commons. And that's moving in the wrong direction. That's the claim. Stating it as starkly as I can to make the dynamics clear. But it doesn't have to be a complete disaster for it to be a bad idea. Run it long enough, it'll get bad, by the way. But, all right. So that's why I think, so remember, right, so at the consistency test, the consistency test said a good theory of business ethics better put people in on these terms that fit Rawls's overall view, which is a good society is one in which we're happy that we live together because your ways of finding advantage for you are also ways in which I can find advantage for me. That's the kind of thing where the division of advantages can be something that we can all freely endorse and welcome. We can be happy that we live among each other and we have to cooperate. Stakeholder theory, I claim, fails this because it does the opposite. It does not put us on terms of mutual advantage. It puts us on zero-sum terms, where I want to make sure that others get less of a stake in how the business runs and I get a lot of a stake in how the business is run. So that's a bad idea, I claim. It fails this consistency test. Here's an alternative, and I'll be real quick. Creatively, I call it the mutual advantage theory. And so what I'm going to say is basically the opposite, right? We should stop doing this, making businesses into a zero-sum affair. We want to make it into a mutual advantage affair. We want a theory of business ethics to encourage managers, companies, producers to act in ways that do live up to Rawls's intuition, that do make people cooperate for mutual advantage. Now, how does that work? Well, here's an idea. My claim is that we can do this by acting in a way that approximates, as much as we can reasonably expect, what we would do under conditions of robust competition. Now, a lot to unpack there, right? Well, I mean, well, think about sort of your basic Econ 101 model of a perfect competition, right? So how does perfect competition work? Well, lots of assumptions have to be made. Here are a bunch of them, not all of them, but so there's no barriers of entry to the market, so everyone who wants to start a new business can. As a result, you get lots of businesses in the market, and you get a lot of consumers, because you can become a consumer in the market with almost no cost. There are no unwanted externalities, so we assume away pollution and things like that. There's no serious information disparities. There's more. There's assumptions, for example, about the interchangeability of goods and so on, but this will do for now. Now, of course, perfect competition we almost never see in real life, if we ever see it in real life, right? So I say like robust competition. We have things in real life that approximate this pretty well, I should say. Now, the claim I'm trying to make is saying that that good businesses act in ways that approach as much as they can under realistic conditions what they would do if they were a robust competition. Now, if you're in a situation of robust competition, you don't have to try very hard. It'll force you to do so. But if you're under situations, that's where the rubber meets the road. Here's a technical phrase. I'm almost done. You might aim at increasing community surplus. Community surplus, the sum of producer and consumer surplus. Basically, the idea being the surpluses of the consumer and the producer representing how much better off they are as a result of the trade. What are the welfare gains to each of the parties involved? Under perfect competition, stop me if I'm wrong, but community surplus is maximized. Because producer surplus and the consumer surplus are as big as they can be together. you move away from perfect competition, usually what happens is what can happen is one party's surplus gets increased at the expense of the other one. But the total sum decreases. It's not just a reshuffling, the total gets smaller. So it's a welfare loss when you don't have perfect competition, is the idea. It's a mutual advantage theory because I think that the way that an ethical business acts within a just society, where the just society aims at mutual advantage, is to interact with their consumers and the people around them in ways that tend towards increasing the surplus, tend towards making the people that are interacting better off for interacting, making their consumers better off, making their suppliers better off, making their neighbors better off for having a business around. Right, that's the abstract version. Here's a translation, right? So interact on positive sum terms. It's basically the idea. Interact for mutual advantage. So some examples. That'll be the last thing. This will close with some examples. What do I have in mind? Well, we don't live in a situation, in a world in which there are no radical information disparities. Sometimes there are radical, but all of the time, even when there are not radical information disparities, almost always there are information disparities. You buy a car, the manufacturer knows more about the car than you do, always, right? Unless you happen to work for the company, I guess. But in my case, they know more. What would it be for the company to make sure that they interact with me in positive sum terms is to not take too much advantage, right? To not take unfair advantage of this disparity in information. Also refrain from creating them. So a good business doesn't send out into the world false information, right? So that people believe things about the products that aren't true, so that they can make a profit. You try to interact with people as if they are informed and consenting people. So you don't try to take advantage of radical information disparities. Someone walks into your shop, you have a painting that's a cheap replica of a Van Gogh. Right? This person is not very smart, thinks it's a real deal. Right? You can charge up the wazoo. It would be wrong for you to do so because you're taking advantage of a radical information disparity where you know it's a fake and they think it's the real deal falsely. So refrain from imposing unwanted externalities. Sometimes the law restricts businesses, or often the law restricts businesses from imposing unwanted externalities. Property rights can do this. Legal regulations can do this. Taxation can do this. But not always. Under the cases where it's possible, my claim is it would be unfair, it would be wrong, unethical for businesses to impose it anyway. Why? Because they're moving away from the type of ideal model that we have in mind, right? The things that they would do under a robust set of competitive conditions. Right. Here's the most obvious thing. Offer their customers, their employees, it's not employers, it should be employees, and their suppliers, a deal that makes them all better off. So you seek, if you're an ethical business, to offer the people you're selling things to, the people you're buying things from, a deal that they're happy to engage in. A deal that they walk away from is thinking, this makes me better off. And last but not least, seek a profit within those constraints. It's mutual advantage after all. Right? Those are limits on your profit-seeking behavior. But if you accept those limits, you can seek your own advantage too. Right. That's a very rough outline of how I think you might develop a better theory of business ethics. My claim is, so summarize very quickly, my claim is a good theory of business ethics should fit within this mutual advantage view that Rawls set out for societies. Stakeholder theory doesn't do that. It effectively recreates the tragedy of the commons, which is a zero-sum, terrible condition. A better version would be to do roughly something like this, but that's just an idea. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Take some questions.
I will, yeah, gladly. Are we doing a queue or something? Like, am I calling on people? Or what? All right.
I have one comment and then a question after. The comments is that this is kind of quite reminiscent of a book that was published this year this may interest you, by that business ethicist and philosopher Charles Koch, called Good Profit, which proposes that the job of an ethical business is to create value for customers while creating value for the business itself. So that might serve as an interesting citation or set of ideas that you could mine for this theory, because I think that it is strikingly similar. And second, my question, here on this slide, refrain from taking advantage of radical information disparities and refrain from creating them. So Coca-Cola, for example, does not say, drink our product, it'll rot your teeth and make you fat, right? Should they?
It's a good question, right? So I don't think necessarily they have to. If it turned out that people thought that drinking Coca-Cola would be equivalent to brushing your teeth with fluoride toothpaste, and that was a reason why lots of people were buying their products, I think there's a stronger case to be made for saying that they ought to, whatever they're doing it's contributing to this way of thinking, they should stop it, right? And if they're making a lot of money off it, then yeah, I think it would be an ethical thing for them to do, is to tell people, you know, this is not true, right? This is a ridiculous thing to think that this is actually as good as brushing your teeth with Colgate. Yeah, I think that seems right to me.
So you talked about perfect competition, but how do you see monopolies fitting in within this new constraint that you're bringing up? Because it seems like so much of our globalized economy is based off monopolies or near monopolies, and it seems like the greatest impact of this theory would be if they started working, if it was perfect competition.
Yeah, right, good. So remember, right, so I'm trying to say there's a division of labor here between the theory of business ethics and the wider theory of what a just society should be like. So there's brighter problems that exist when you have monopolies. Right? So it allows them to overcharge without much economic ramification. It's the main problem. You might want to change the conditions that create a monopoly, right? Often that's a good idea, but that's the broader question. It's about what's the system that we've built up. The question I'm trying to address here is like, okay, let's say that you find yourself as a monopolist. What would be an ethical way for you to run the business? Right? It's not stop making a profit, right, altogether. But it is, I think, there's a difference between what you can charge on the monopoly conditions and what you would be able to charge on the more robustly competitive conditions. And to the extent that you are eating into that difference, so the price you're actually charging is more than what you could be charging, I think you're overcharging. Now, there's an interesting question here, right? So there are some cases where monopolies are created on purpose, so they're called patents, right? And a patent, what we do is we create a monopoly, a temporary monopoly for a company to recoup the investment. So there's tricky things there. The thing to answer that, I think, is to say that there is the idea is that why is the patent given only for a set number of years? It's that there is a lot of upfront cost that you need to get into to get the product on the market, right? And you wouldn't be able to recoup that if we just let you charge whatever would be possible on the robustly competitive prices. So nobody would bring the good to the market. A lot of R&D involved in bringing a new piece of medicine on the market. Once the R&D is done, it's real cheap to make the next pill, right? So if everyone can just sort of copy your pill once you've invented it, the price of pills get really, really low, and you'll never recoup the investment that you had to get into to invent the medicine, and so nobody will actually start researching new medicine anymore. That's the problem, right? So there's going to be a certain price that we expect when we set up a patent system, a certain price that reflects what would be a reasonable time within which you get to recoup your investment cost. That would be similar to what you would be allowed to overcharge under this theory. Yeah, we have, I guess, have it.
So with refraining from imposing unwanted externalities, are you thinking of that by going beyond the legal framework or just abiding within the legal framework? And if you're thinking about going beyond it, how do you balance that with seeking a profit? Because you can always reduce unwanted externalities up until the point where you're not making a profit.
Well, so I definitely think it's more than just the law. because one of the problems is that, I mean, one of the places where business ethics becomes relevant, I think, is when the law is not correctly enforcing the protection, like the prevention of unwanted externalities. I'm not sure why you say that you can always reduce them up to the point that your business is out of existence.
So like for instance, with environmental issues, you can almost endlessly make things more greener, invest in areas that are going to like reduce it, just like a marginal return, the negative externalities or unwanted externalities, and you can invest almost entirely of your profit in doing that. And so it seems like that's, those are not something that you invest some cost in and they're gone. They're something that you invest in with, differentiating returns, both profitability and in terms of how many externalities you have. So what's your framework for kind of navigating that balance?
Right, good. Right, so the idea is, sort of, if I get you correctly, like, so you have let's say you have a factory that builds cars, right? There's going to be fumes coming out of the chimneys, and so they impose externalities, right? That's what using energy does that. And so if we refrain from altogether, then you should just shut it down. Is that the idea?
No, not necessarily, but that you could take the profit that you make from that factory, and you could take the profit you make from that factory and invest it all in like making those fumes better for the environment, or reducing that, changing your fuel type so that your fumes aren't quite as bad. So not to the point where you're not operating, but to the point where your profit is zero and you still are operating.
Yeah, good. Presumably, when you make no profit, there's very little point in keeping going, right? So there has to be some reasonable profit margin allowed, even under robust competition, right? So that would be the framework that I would go back to. The idea was, so under conditions of robust competition, there are a set of externalities that we're happy to live with, right? And there's a set of externalities that we think would be ruled out. And so those would be the ones that you try to approximate as it's reasonably possible.
And how do you discern those, apart from the legal environment? How do you discern which externalities are, viable and which ones you shouldn't participate in? Kind of what's your framework for deciding that?
I don't know. It's a good question. Okay. So, I mean, I have ideas about it, right? Like, I mean, when you ask, like, how do you as a manager decide about it? We're going to need a good theory of property rights to begin with. We're going to need a good theory about how to deal with certain resources that are not well protected by property rights. But that's a general worry, right? This is a general worry about what is a socially acceptable level of externalities or pollution. Any theory of business ethics, any theory of justice is going to have to deal with that question. So to the extent that we have a good answer to it, that's the answer that I'm going to use. Now, it's not by any means a settled question, but I'm not sure I mean, it's not necessarily a worry for the theory, I think. But it is a worry in real life. That's for sure.
I have a question about the externalities related to the discussion you just had, but not exactly the same. So if the goal is to have a society that enables cooperation to mutual advantage,
yeah.
That doesn't require that all exchanges must be to everyone's mutual advantage. Because surely we would want to allow exchanges between parties A and B that might not be to C's advantage. So A and B exchange, and so B's business goes out of business. That's okay. But if you allow that, so then what it must mean is that we want a society that leads to on-net advantage for everybody that's part of it, if not in spot transactions.
Right.
Okay, if you're going to allow me that, then it seems
well, I'm not quite allowing that, but yeah.
Well, it seems then you're on the horns of a dilemma then, because either you're excluding too much or you're including too much. By which I mean it may be the case that you either allow all sorts of transactions, either you exclude all sorts of transactions that in fact lead to overall benefit, like the creative destruction that Schumpeter describes. So yeah, there's destruction, but there's also creation. Or on the other side of it, what you might end up doing is you allow people to. So if you're willing to allow those kinds of transactions to take place, in which it's okay that some people suffer some disadvantage because you and I had a mutually advantageous transaction, then maybe that might actually justify some businesses engaging in practices that don't seem to aim directly at benefiting others, directly others, because indirectly, lots of people might benefit.
Good. So, okay, I'm not 100% sure I quite see the dilemma. Okay, well, let me run through the thinking here, right? So, the part I would resist is, I think that one way of interpreting what you were saying is the right way to think about it. So, like, accept those interactions that on net will be to mutual advantage. That allows for too much, right? Because it allows for, if you say that any exchange is ethical if it's part of an overall system that is mutually advantageous. That allows for all sorts of exploitative or unfair exchanges, right? You might say, well, I rip you off with this crappy replica of a Van Gogh because you're a moron who thinks it's a real deal, right? But you know, the system of when people put things for sale on their shops generally works to people's advantage. So there's nothing wrong when I don't tell you.
But on net, it's a benefit.
Right. Well, so if the theory would hold that anything goes as long as it helps make up a system that on net is a benefit, would be a bad theory, I think, because it would start allowing these type of exchanges as perfectly ethically acceptable. And I think that's the type of exchange that we should condemn. It's bad. You should know if you know that this person is under a radically false belief. Don't try and make a profit that way. So okay, if I'm excluding this, so I want to allow creative destruction, right? What we need, of course, is this is similar to the externalities question, right? We need to know who are the relevant parties to the exchange.
Right. Which leads you to stakeholder theory.
Well, stakeholder theory says everyone, right?
Well, everyone who's connected, everyone who's affected.
Right.
So what I'm suggesting.
So terrible ID.
What I'm suggesting is that it's not clear then if you say you want to refrain from imposing unwanted externalities. How is that not just a slippery slope right down to stakeholder theory? Where's the bright line that distinguishes whose externalities we care about and whose externalities we don't care about, without leading you in either of those two directions that you just said you didn't want to go?
Good. I'll have to think about that. That's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, I'll think about it.
I have
Yeah.
I have two short questions. The first is about the first point up there, taking advantage of and creating radical information disparities. Is information in that sense distinct from technology? And if not, how could Silicon Valley function on that? And with regard to the third point, just a quick question, offer effectively everybody a deal that makes them better off. In even the most cutthroat system, who would take a deal that doesn't make them better off?
Well, let's go to the first question first. I didn't quite get it. What was there's a difference between information and?
It seems to me that, we were talking about Uber earlier in the day, that seems to make most of its profit off information disparities and capitalizing on them. Would that be allowed on your model?
Well, so the reason why I went for robust competition instead of perfect competition is because I recognize that obviously in real life, we never work under exactly equal information. Right? And that, of course, is in part why the market works the way it does, right? Because those offer people profit opportunities by making information available, which is one of the things that Uber does. Makes available like Professor Anderson said, who's looking for a ride and who has a ride available. So that's okay, but I don't take that to be the kind of radical information disparity that we've been talking about so far, right? So radical information disparity would be something quite different, where people are sort of seriously misguided about what it is that they're buying or what it is that they're selling, perhaps. And you might not know that it really is a Van Gogh. Right? Now, the second question was. It was about like who will make a deal that makes them better off. So the idea would be that you try to tend towards the type of exchange that would increase community surplus, right? So that increases the total sum of how good both parties are after they make the exchange compared to how well off they were before the exchange. So you might offer me a deal that makes me marginally better off, but under other conditions, you could offer me a deal that makes both of us together much better off than the first deal. In that case, if we're comparing those two exchanges, I'm claiming that the second is morally preferable to the first.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the benchmark has to be more than just not make people worse off than they were before they met you, right? The benchmark has to be try to maximize the mutual gain as much as you can within the constraints and so on.
Yeah, to clarify on that last point, so you would say that that you should try to maximize the system benefit even if it comes at a cost to the business's profit?
Yeah, so sure, there are cases in which you could rip someone off and make more of a profit as a result, and then
No, I'm not like let's say we interact and our interaction gives me can give me $4 benefit and you $1 benefit, or can give us both $3 benefit.
Right.
You would say that that I would be morally obligated as a business to choose the option where we both get $3 benefit because it maximizes the system efficiency at the expense of my profit.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would put in the language of obligation, but sure. I think it'd be the morally better thing for you to do would be to sell it at the 3-3 advantage than at the 4-1 advantage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.